All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're going under with Das Boot.
Oh, excellent
I
choice.
know, right? I got this incredible review, and, well, now I kind of just want to watch the film. But first,
Yeah, we gotta break it down.
exactly. So we're talking 1981, German film, World War II U-boat crew. What is it about this Das Boot that makes it so gripping?
It's more than just a war film. You get pulled into the reality of it. Like, this review really digs into how the director, Petersen, was all about authenticity. Recreated the cramped type sea U-boat, the psychological strain, the whole thing.
Yeah, the review kept saying unflinching realism, and I felt that. The
Yeah.
way Peterson captures, like, the crew's physical and mental state is all happening in this incredibly tight space.
Oh, absolutely. No oxygen, stifling heat, the constant fear of being detected. Talk about pressure.
Intense. And the way Peterson uses the camera, it's like he takes you through those narrow hallways, into those cramped bunks. You're not just watching, you're right there with them.
Claustrophobia central. You feel it.
Totally. And then the sound design, engines rumbling, that hull creaking under pressure. Then you hear the crew, just these hushed voices. And then silence. Just dead silence.
Yeah.
It's like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. It's like Peterson wants you to feel that dread, that anticipation. Every sound, every silence just pulls you deeper into the submarine.
It's brilliant, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this tense atmosphere, and then you add these incredibly well-developed characters. The review, it raves about Jürgen Prochnow as this captain.
Mhm.
He has to balance, like, his authority with the sheer stress of command.
Right. It's more than just giving orders. It's about the weight of all those lives in his hands.
Heavy stuff.
And it's not just him. The review also mentions the chief engineer who's battling to keep the sub running as his own mental state's deteriorating.
Right, right.
And then there's the propaganda officer, like this stark reminder of Nazi ideology. It's really interesting seeing all these personalities crammed in together, each one dealing with the war in their own way.
It's like a microcosm of wartime Germany, right? All within this metal tube under the ocean. But here's what I found so interesting. The review calls Das Boot an anti-war film.
Yeah.
Now, how does a film set on a German U-boat in World War II manage that? It seems, I don't know, kind of contradictory.
It is, and that's what makes it so powerful. Instead of glorifying combat, showing soldiers as these invincible heroes, Das Boot focuses on how vulnerable they are, just trying to survive.
Yeah.
The pointlessness of war. They're not just following orders, they're people trapped in a nightmare.
So it's about humanizing, I guess, the enemy.
Mm.
Showing that there's another side to this story. The review talks about how Peterson avoids those typical stereotypes we see about German soldiers.
Yeah.
We get a more complex view of why they're there, the ethical dilemmas they face.
Exactly. We don't often see that in war films. Das Boot makes you look beyond good versus evil. It's war, it's complicated.
You're forced to see these characters as individuals, no matter what uniform they're wearing. Now, this surprised me. The review praises the film's, what did they call it? Austerity, I think. Especially when it comes to action and special effects. They actually contrasted it with other war films that, go crazy with the battle scenes.
Yeah.
So, help me out here. Why is restraint so effective in a movie like this?
Well, think about it. The submarine itself, right? You're trapped underwater. Every creak, every groan of that metal hull, it just adds to this feeling of being hunted. Peterson doesn't need explosions or huge battles. The tension is built in.
So instead of those big action moments, the film keeps you on edge by just constantly reminding you of the danger.
Right, exactly.
And I guess that makes the anti-war message even stronger, because it's not about glorifying the fighting. It's about the never-ending fear and exhaustion of war.
It's about the real cost of war on a human level, and that's what makes it stick with you.
I think you mentioned this earlier, but there are multiple versions of Das Boot.
There are, several different cuts. Some shorter, like the original theatrical release. Then there's an extended version with footage from the TV miniseries. A bunch of different Das Boot experiences out there.
Wow. So I guess the longer version lets you really get lost in that world, connect with the characters.
For sure. But the review, I think they suggested there's a sort of sweet spot version, something like 204 minutes. They said it finds a good balance between detail and pacing.
Okay, so what would you say to someone who's, deciding which version to watch? Is there a wrong choice?
Not really. It depends on what you're looking for. If you want to completely immerse yourself in the story, explore every nook and cranny, then maybe go for the extended cut. But if you want something a little tighter, more focused, then the shorter versions are great.
Like choosing your level of depth, right?
Exactly. Dip your toes in or take the full plunge. But no matter what, you're in for a powerful experience. This is a film that stays with you.
Which reminds me of something else the review highlighted. Seeing World War II from the German perspective?
Yeah.
We don't often get that, especially in Western cinema. Why do you think that's so important, particularly in Das Boot?
It challenges us to think differently. We have our own biases, right? But Das Boot shows the human beings behind the uniforms, even uniforms we might, find reprehensible.
Reminding us that these were individuals with their own stories.
And it's not about condoning what the Nazi regime did. Das Boot doesn't shy away from the horrors of war. It's about presenting a different angle, understanding the human cost for everyone involved.
Powerful stuff. We've covered a lot. As we continue exploring Das Boot, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should hold on to?
Remember, this is more than just a submarine movie. It's about people, about resilience in the face of unimaginable stress and fear. And it makes you think about the real cost of war, not just the lives lost, but the scars it leaves behind.
No winners, just survivors. But before we go further, I have to ask, how did watching this film make you feel? Knowing the historical context, the awful reality of that war.
Honestly, it's hard to watch Das Boot without feeling uneasy. You know what these characters represent, the atrocities that were committed. But that's also what makes it so important. We have to confront those uncomfortable truths, look at the complexity of war, and remember the human stories within those larger events.
Absolutely. So as we move into the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener with something to think about. How does Das Boot challenge your own ideas about heroes and villains in war? Something to keep in mind as we go deeper.
A great question to ponder, and I think we'll find even more to unpack as we explore this masterpiece. Welcome back. Before we came up for air, you asked a great question about, the impact of watching this film, knowing the history behind it. It really gets to the heart of what makes Das Boot so powerful, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely stuck with me. And this review, it makes me realize just how much Petersen achieves inside that submarine. Like, it becomes a character itself, right? You feel the tension, and it reflects the crew's psychological state. The review even mentioned how he portrays so carefully their physical and mental deterioration.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just the torpedoes and depth charges. It's the constant pressure, the fear of being trapped, the isolation, all within this, cramped metal tube. They're literally under the waves with the enemy all around.
And the review highlighted how those external threats, they kind of mirror the internal conflicts happening on the submarine. Like you have the different personalities clashing, the burden of command on the captain, and then that ever-present Nazi ideology.
Yeah, it's like Petersen's running a social experiment almost. You take this group, officers, engineers, enlisted men, and you stick them in this pressure cooker, and then you see how the stress, it just brings out those existing tensions, exposes the cracks in their beliefs.
There's a part where the review talks about the sound design and how it just adds to that feeling of unease and psychological strain. That constant engine rumble, the creaking hull, then those sudden silences, it's unnerving.
It's totally intentional. Those sounds, they're not just background noise. Petersen uses them to put us right there with the crew. We hear those sounds, and it's like we're experiencing their anxieties, their dwindling hope. It's really incredible how sound can be used to get inside a character's head.
And speaking of characters, the review really praises Jürgen Prochnow performance as the captain. They say he goes way beyond that, typical war hero stereotype. He shows us a man burdened by responsibility, grappling with the danger he's leading his crew into.
Exactly. He's not some fearless, invincible leader. He's human. We see his doubts, his vulnerability, and it makes him relatable. It makes you wonder, what does real leadership look like when the stakes are that high?
It raises some interesting questions, like, is it truly heroic to just follow orders when those orders put your men in danger? Where do you draw the line between duty and self-preservation?
It's that moral gray area that Das Boot really forces us to think about. And it's not just the captain. The review mentions other characters, like the chief engineer, who's really struggling. His mental state is, it's deteriorating along with the submarine. He represents that struggle to hold things together when everything around you is falling apart.
Like every character embodies a different way people react under pressure. Some break, some harden, some find ways to cope. It's like Petersen is saying, look, this is the range of human responses when you're pushed to the limit.
Right, and it's all contained within this microcosm of the submarine. It's what makes the film so fascinating to analyze. We're not just watching a war movie, we're watching the study of human behavior under extreme stress.
And the review also points out how Das Boot avoids, glorifying violence. Which is interesting because a lot of war movies, they kind of revel in those battle scenes. They suggest that by holding back, Petersen actually makes his anti-war message even stronger.
It's a choice that really works. By avoiding all that gratuitous violence, all the spectacle, Peterson forces us to focus on the psychological effects of war. We feel the tension, the fear, the suddenness of death. But we don't get distracted by explosions and all that.
It's like those moments of silence we talked about. The absence of action, it creates its own kind of tension. It's a reminder that war isn't some game. It's about the constant possibility of being wiped out.
And that approach really emphasizes the anti-war message. It's not about celebrating victories, it's about showing how brutal war really is for everyone.
Before we move on, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the different versions of Das Boot. Why do you think there's so many cuts of this film? What do they offer to viewers?
Well, I think Peterson wanted to really explore the story in all its, depth. The longest cut, the one with the miniseries footage, gives you this incredibly immersive experience. You really get to know those characters, their relationships.
Sounds perfect for a real deep dive, right? But the review seems to suggest the shorter versions are worth watching too.
Yeah, they're definitely more accessible, maybe a better place to start if you're seeing it for the first time. It's like, choosing between a long walk through a museum versus a guided tour. Both can be great. It just depends what you're looking for.
No right or wrong answer, just different ways to experience the film.
Exactly. And I think it speaks to the power of Das Boot, that it can be enjoyed in so many different ways. No matter which version you watch, it leaves a mark.
And speaking of impact, the review highlighted the importance of seeing World War II from the German perspective. That's not something we get very often, especially in Hollywood films. Why is that perspective so crucial, especially in a film like this?
It makes us check our own biases. We're so used to seeing the enemy as, this faceless force. But Das Boot reminds us that there were human beings behind those uniforms, even if we don't agree with what they represent.
It's about recognizing that shared humanity, even in the midst of something as horrific as war.
And it's not about saying what they did was right. Das Boot doesn't shy away from the horrors of the Nazi regime. It's about presenting another side of the story, understanding the human cost for everybody involved.
It's a powerful message. Before we finish this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something we discussed before, the submarine itself. The review talked about how that confined setting, that claustrophobia, really shapes the characters and their interactions. It's more than just a backdrop.
Absolutely. That submarine, it becomes this little microcosm of society. Social hierarchies, personal conflicts, ideological clashes, it all gets magnified in that pressure cooker.
Like a giant social experiment almost. You take this group of people, stick them together in this tiny space and see what happens.
And under that pressure, their flaws, their vulnerabilities, but also those moments of humanity, it all comes out.
It's what makes Das Boot so compelling. It's not just about the submarine or the war, it's about the people. How they survive, how they hold on to their sanity, their humanity, when everything is stacked against them.
And that submarine, it plays such a huge role in that. It's not just a setting, it's practically a character in itself.
As we get ready to come up for air one last time, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about. How does that submarine, that symbol of confinement and isolation, how does it contribute to the film's overall message about the cost of war? It's something to consider as we explore the final act of this masterpiece. All right, back for the final dive into Das Boot. Before we resurface, I want to circle back to something we keep coming back to, that submarine setting. It really shapes how these characters, how they interact, right?
No, absolutely. It becomes this world unto itself. You're trapped in this steel tube, and everything just gets amplified. The hierarchies, the ideologies, those personal conflicts. There's no escaping it. That tension, the constant threat, it changes people.
The review pointed out how Petersen uses this to show different parts of German society at the time.
Right.
Like, you've got the older guys, those battle-hardened crew members, next to these young recruits, some still kind of romanticizing war. And then the whole officer versus enlisted men dynamic, which obviously gets even more intense when it's, life or death.
And you can't forget about the ideological stuff either. You've got the propaganda officer pushing Nazi rhetoric while others are starting to doubt, to question. It's like Petersen's using this submarine to explore the bigger picture of what was going on in Germany during the war.
But what gets me is Petersen doesn't give you easy answers. There aren't clear-cut good guys and bad guys here. Just these complicated characters trying to make sense of what they're seeing, what they're experiencing.
Yeah, because even in war, people are people. There's incredible courage, sure, but also moments of cowardice, those instincts for self-preservation. It's messy, it's complicated, and it makes you wonder, how would I react?
Exactly. Das Boot isn't some simple story about right and wrong. It's about those gray areas, the things that make you think. And it reminds you that even on opposite sides of a conflict, there are human beings. each with their own reasons, their own struggles.
And it challenges those narratives we often get about war, especially because the story is coming from the German perspective.
Right, the review kept coming back to that. How important it is to see the war from this angle, which we rarely get in Western film. Why is that so crucial, especially in a story like Das Boot?
It challenges us to look inward. You know, we have our own biases, our own ideas of who the enemy is. But Das Boot shows us the people on the other side, reminds us they also had families, they had fears, they had dreams.
It's about seeing that shared humanity, even in the middle of something as awful as war.
And it's not about justifying their actions or saying what happened was okay. Das Boot doesn't do that. It just shows another side, helps us understand what it costs for everyone.
I think that's such an important message. We're wrapping up our deep dive here, and I'm just struck by how relevant this film still feels. Came out over 40 years ago, but it still resonates so strongly today. What do you think gives it that lasting power?
It's a story about people, about surviving, the courage, the fear, the struggle to hold on to your humanity. These are timeless themes.
It's about the human spirit, the ability to find hope even in the darkest moments. And yeah, it's a reminder that war is never the answer. A message that feels, I don't know, maybe even more relevant now than it was back in '81.
Well said. As we say goodbye to Das Boot, I really hope folks will seek it out or, even rewatch it. Maybe you'll see it in a new light.
It's definitely a film that stays with you. That's got to be the sign of a true masterpiece, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it reminds us what stories can do. They can take us to other places, make us question things, and maybe, just maybe, help us understand each other a little better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, we've reached the surface of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this underwater journey.